Good evening. This is the Brattleboro Planning Commission meeting for Wednesday, October 10th, 2012. And I'd like to call the meeting to order. The chairman, Mr. Valente, will be joining us shortly. The first order of business is to approve the minutes of September 10th.
So moved.
Any discussion?
Need a second first, don't you?
Second.
Second. Okay. Any discussion?
I think they pretty much hit all the different points that we talked about on the matrix from the comments on the town plan.
Mm-hmm. Julia did her usual lovely job.
Yeah.
Hey.
No?
Did option 2 on the...
Look at the bottom.
Oh, very nice, Sue.
Oh,
Oh, that's it. There you go. Respectful.
No, Julia, huh?
No,
That's
Julia.
it. Correction.
I spared her.
Yeah. I have to retort that last statement.
Did option 2 on the PUD process get outlined there? I got a little confused reading this, but I basically felt like we had it in the end what our vote was, but...
You moved that the Planning Commission adopt option 2. Was their response?
Yeah.
Mr. Stroud seconded.
Yeah. But in option 2, it doesn't go back to the select board, is that correct?
That's right.
That's correct.
If somebody wants to do a,
If someone wants to do a zoning change,
they
that
have to
goes
come back
to
to
select.
us.
Yes, that's
Okay.
the planning commission, then the select board, because that's the way a zoning change gets done ordinarily.
Oh, so they would have to go to the select board only if they want a zoning change?
Yeah.
Okay, that's fine.
But if they keep within the uses that were prescribed.
Right.
Then they're fine.
Then
Then
it's,
it's
then it's
streamlined.
straight off to the DIB, and that's where it ends.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I understood that, but I just wasn't sure if it was clear in the minutes,
Right.
but I think it's fine.
Right.
No problem.
Okay. Any announcements?
Did we vote?
Oh,
Oh.
I thought we already did that.
No, I was just doing my usual blah blah around
Okay.
minutes.
Shall we vote to see who, if we can approve the minutes of September 10th? All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Any noes? The motion has carried. Okay, now, announcements. Sue, do you have announcements?
So a reminder that the Wyndham Regional Commission is sponsoring the Rivers Conference, Southern Vermont Rivers Conference, on October 16th, which I think is Tuesday, in Wilmington at Union Hall. Has anybody registered to attend that?
I'm
Not
thinking
registered,
about
but-
it.
But I'm thinking about it.
Okay. You should RSVP.
Lunch is
Either.
free, I guess, as long as you RSVP.
Yeah.
Free lunch.
So
No
you
such
should,
thing as a free lunch. Go on.
You gotta listen to them first.
so I can either
Except this timeshare.
you should call Wyndham Regional Commission or email Dinah.
Dinah Reed.
Or you can let me know and I can.
Donna Reed. Not Donna Reed?
No,
Dinah.
not
Dinah.
Dinah. And
Is anybody from the planning office going?
Brian's gonna go, and some sturdy members of the DIB are gonna go
Okay, I was thinking there was a way.
This is being held where at?
in Wilmington.
Local, more or less.
Relatively local.
Relatively local.
All flood issues have been directed to Wilmington.
Yes. The flood capital of Vermont.
Southern Vermont.
Oh, sorry, yes.
Any other announcements?
The other thing we just wanted to let you know about EPA's Building Blocks for Sustainable Communities and Smart Growth America have put out requests for letters of interest on they basically have a variety of tools that towns can apply for to have kind of an analysis and a workshop with recommendations given. So we are going to be applying for a tool that is Smart Growth Zoning Codes for Small Cities. We'll make an application to EPA and to Smart Growth America. If we were awarded, it would only be through one organization. And basically this would kind of give us a jump start on the zoning ordinance. We'd hear in November or December if we were selected, and then workshops would be held sometime from January to May. And so basically it would be a workshop with follow-up recommendations. They would do an audit of our
So people would
of our
come
regulations.
from Washington?
Yeah, if it was through the EPA, it could be from the Boston office or it could be from Washington. Smart Growth America, I think, is based in Washington. They have a couple of partners too. So.
They were going to use large, like Eastern Seaboard sized a consulting firm. I think
It depended on
yeah,
which
it
one.
depended on which one it was, but yeah.
Mhm. I know Lisa Jackson, she used to be the DEP commissioner from New Jersey.
Yeah. I don't think she'll be coming to do it, but
No,
it'd be pretty fancy if she was.
she was in Vermont not too long ago.
Yes, she was.
She lost.
She's the head of EPA.
Oh.
No, she
It was
not.
like Ray LaHood was here the other day too. And I was like, he was lost.
I think they all need to go to New Hampshire.
Yeah, I think that's what it is.
Any more announcements?
I have a question. What's happened with the update on the AARP?
AARP, good question.
Oh yeah.
Process. We were meeting on a regular basis, and then we were going to submit something, or
Yeah,
Yep.
we are picking up the RFP that was helped to write to get that ready to release,
Yep.
to get a firm involved to look at it.
and what does that mean?
So we have the implementation money. We have the $3,000
Right.
for a conceptual design to be done. So we have to do an request for proposals to basically.
Yeah,
accept
that's what we've been in
proposals.
the process of.
Yeah, I mean it did get put aside because we
Oh,
got
all
too
right.
busy in the office. So
Yeah, because
Yeah,
I ran
we're
into
just
some
editing
people
it.
at the farmer's market, and they were just sort of asking whatever happened to all that, because that was, a lot of meetings for a while, and then
Yep.
clunk. So,
And the
I think
town
it
is
got lost
also
in the town plan.
yeah, it got lost.
the town separately has submitted a grant, has received a grant, and is going to work with a bike ped organisation based out of Burlington for other work. So, and I'm not sure when that's going to be scheduled. So,
To do what?
to work with the town on bike and pedestrian safety issues. That's my understanding.
is that the local motion?
Yeah.
But the Canal Street piece will be picked back up again?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Maybe, I know was an email list for that group that was meeting. Is there a possibility just to send out an email to update people so they kind of know what's,
Yeah.
not that it's just sort of say what's
Yeah.
Sure.
status
That's a good
report,
idea.
Okay.
We're not out there hanging in the blue, because, I think people are beginning to, just the fact that a couple people mention it to me just means people are wondering.
Okay.
People are starting to talk, is that?
Yeah, what happened? Is
There's a
another
lot
one of
of
those
that.
things that kind of fell in the gutter and never to be
Well,
seen again?
yeah.
So I don't think so, but I thought
Okay.
we were working on the RFP, so if you could that would be
Yeah.
great.
All right.
Okay, any more announcements? We should move on to public comment, and now we have a member of the public, so if you would like to comment.
I have no comment.
Very good. Moving right along. Select board hearing on proposed town plan. That would be Rod and Sue.
Do you want to do it? It's no big secret. Or do you
Yeah,
want
it's no big secret except for it's really not on Thanksgiving. Thank you, Carol.
Yes.
Oh, okay.
I had turkey on my brain. So you got a proposed work plan, and if you had a chance to look at it, you'll see that the select board has scheduled their 2 public hearings. So the first one's going to be on November 5th. It's a Monday night. It is a special meeting for them, so that they chose to have it on not a regular select board meeting night. And then the second one is going to be on Tuesday, November 20th. Here, that's a regular select board meeting night, so it'll be part of their agenda. Both meetings will be at 6:15. That's their normal meeting time. So hopefully you will be there. If you're not going to be able to attend, just let us know, please.
Yeah.
Will we be presenting the plan, or is the select board just going to be reviewing it?
I think the first one, where the only topic of the select board meeting is the public hearing, a brief outline, probably based on the report that we were required to submit, would be adequate to
Introduce the plan.
introduce the plan. And then we were expecting, the public to be present and just follow, whatever the comments and remarks are. We're not sure. We've not had any feedback directly from the select board yet. We'd hope to be able to help them with clarifying questions or background material or whatever they needed prior to the hearing, so that they weren't engaging with the document, as it were, for the first time, or bringing up their concerns or issues without having had support on those before. And then we feel like the second meeting, which is actually scheduled for a regular select board meeting, will be one agenda item of many. And that will be really, hopefully, an opportunity for the select board members to make any kind of comments that they want to make and vote on it. And that wouldn't be a very lengthy agenda item at that point, unless, of course, we find issues that need some further explanation or resolution, and then that might change. But I would hope that by the end of the first public hearing, we would have a good sense of how things are going to proceed.
And if there were issues or items in the town plan that were of, let's say, great concern to some people, that were made known that night. I mean, I know some of them, again, if some of the same issues that came up at our public hearings came up again,
Right.
What's the process for handling that?
The select board can recommend minor changes and still go ahead and adopt the plan.
Okay.
If the amendments that they're suggesting are substantive, in other words, a change of policy or a change of a map boundary or something such as that, of consequence, then it actually is handed back to the Planning Commission, and the Planning Commission is required to schedule another public hearing and address the issue, and the Planning Commission has to resolve, basically they have to take the...
I actually think that's not true. The more I read it, I think that if it's a substantive change, they can make it, but they do need to, they need to have a 15-day rewarn of the hearing. I don't think
They have to hand
I
it
had
back to the
previously
select
always
board?
thought
Or
that
to
it
the
had to
Planning
go back
Commission?
to the Planning Commission,
Okay.
but I think they can make the change. They just need to rewarn a hearing.
Okay.
Right.
But
They do have the option of handing it back and saying this issue needs to be resolved
Yeah.
in a different way or whatever it is.
And generally, I think that's the way select boards do it, because
And what
not
if they
the work
make a
they
change
usually
that the
do.
planning board doesn't support?
Well,
Good question.
I mean, I think it's
$50
really-
million question.
no, I think the point of the public hearing with the select board is for the Planning Commission to be able to defend their work. And so if even despite the Planning Commission defending their work, the select board still wants to make a change, as the body that adopts the plan, they're empowered to do that. It would be clear, I guess, at that point that they are overruling the Planning Commission at that point.
Yeah.
Basically, if they are going to make a substantive change, the Planning Commission is required to write a report
Yep.
prior to the public hearing or at the public hearing that analyzes the extent to which the changed proposal, when taken together with the rest of the plan, is consistent with the legislative goals established. So I think
That
if
could
you
happen
didn't
in
agree
between
with
the
it,
two meetings.
yeah, if you didn't agree with what they were proposing,
So the meeting that would be
Statewide.
probably most important for us to be at would be that first Monday meeting, I would say.
well, I think we need to be.
I was going to say, I think we need to have as many commissioners as possible at both meetings.
Both, yeah.
Yeah.
But so if the planning, it's all just hypothetical, but if the select board made a change that we found to be contrary to the goals that the state has laid out, we would say so.
Yes.
Report. Yep.
Yes, and they can't, I mean, it's a point of interpretation, but they can't really amend the plan in a way that means that it no longer conforms with a state requirement.
Yeah.
Interesting.
So we would need to,
They could.
yeah, we would need to be sort of on our toes enough to be able to make that case. I mean, I think the issue is that the language is pretty broad and
Okay.
Liz, Maggie,
Oh.
Maggie has a
Oh,
question.
we
I
have
think.
a member of the public. Please state your name.
Yes, Maggie Bartenhagen, Town Plan Advisory Group. And just for point of clarification, what happens after November 20th if the plan is accepted by the select board, then what? Is it then adopted?
Yes.
It is, okay.
And then then there's a waiting period of a short time, and then it's in effect. Isn't there
I
some?
don't think
There's no waiting period.
Not with town plan. The zoning there is.
Okay.
So it goes into effect.
Yeah, I think I might be confusing it with zoning ordinances. I think it's in effect.
Okay.
Yep.
And would the Town Plan Advisory Group members be notified of these select board meetings so that they're...
We are in the process of sending an invitation to Town Plan Advisory Group members so that they can, if they would like to attend, that they're able to
are
attend.
aware?
They'd be more than welcome.
They'd be welcome to attend.
Thank
Yes.
you.
We feel that having friendly faces.
Would be really useful. Yeah.
And can testify to the public participation.
Right.
Right, exactly.
Now, the special meeting is going to be held here.
Here.
Yeah.
Okay. So that way people know, the public knows where they're going to be held at.
Yep.
On the second select board hearing, same place here too, okay.
Yep.
Okay, anything else on select board hearings? Moving right along.
Wow, that was a short 30 minutes.
Yeah.
Well, we didn't know how much.
Discussion that people are going to.
Yep.
Work plan for the remainder of 2012.
So we had met with James at the end of September, and as many of you may know that DRB has been hot to discuss subdivision regulations, and we felt that it was something that we could tackle relatively quickly, with the goal of hopefully being able to complete it by the end of the year or shortly after the new year, and then have public hearings. So we had decided that it would be good to get everybody on the same footing and start with a training and have an outline of what we saw the regulations would be for this meeting. We have spoke with Tim Cuthbertson, the chair of the DRB, and we will have a joint meeting with them. For those of you that have been on the commission for a while, you might remember that they've wanted to meet for some time, and we kept putting it off. So it'll be
We did have a joint meeting with them, didn't they? It was kind of a bust, though. Like we heard
well,
their
that was
comments
about
on
the town plan
Town
land use
plan.
chapter. We had
Yep.
invited them. Yeah, this is they definitely have comments about subdivision regulations, and Tim said there would probably be a handful of other small zoning type things they might want to talk about.
Yeah, I think they were doing some of their own research earlier this year about subdivision regs too.
Yeah,
I remember watching one of their meetings.
yeah. So that will be at the next meeting on the 22nd, and then we will present on November 14th the first draft of subdivision regulations to begin going through, and then for the second November meeting of the Planning Commission, we'll just keep discussing them and then have a second draft in December and see where we go from there. I mean, it might take a while to get through it,
Yeah.
but and then we will not meet on Christmas Eve. So there'll be one meeting in December.
Yep.
The 14th, that's a, what day is that?
That is it's another Wednesday. Monday is Veterans Day.
Veterans Day.
So the municipal offices are closed.
So it goes.
Thanks
Okay.
for pointing that
Monday,
out, because it is a
Yes.
special night.
Right.
Monday, Wednesday, Tuesday, Monday. Sounds good.
And so, yeah, I mean, the only thing to point out here is that obviously next month is a pretty heavy month
Yes.
in terms
Yeah.
of meeting obligations. So, but we should be able to hump it by then.
Okay.
Okay. Okay, so that's all right?
Yeah. Sounds
Any
good.
other comments on the work plan?
Scum
Moving
breaks.
right
Get out of here by
Uh-huh.
7.
All right, let's have some subdivision training.
All right, subdivisions.
Great handouts.
Oh, yeah? You like them? Good.
Thanks. Something to.
Maps. I'm a map person. you know,
Yeah.
So, and diagrams, and I can pick out which house I want to be in and which trails.
There you
know,
go.
And how it makes sense. No.
Well, so some of you on the planning commission might be more aware of the subdivision and subdivision process. Kimberly, you've been on the DRB, and so some of this might be a little repetitive for some of you. But anyway, so subdivision is the process of creating legally defined parcels of land, and so the primary purpose of reviewing it is to promote orderly and cost-effective growth within the community, protect public health and safety, mitigate impacts to the environment and surrounding properties. So basically it's to ensure safe and usable division of parcels. So a subdivision is anytime you divide one lot. Well, there's kind of a technical definition that's a little crazier, but if you're creating a new lot, or if you're even moving the boundaries of a lot, that is considered a subdivision.
More typically, once you get over the breaking up one larger parcel into two small parcels, more typically when we think of a subdivision on sort of a suburban scale, we think of it as involving a road. And so really the process of a subdivision is making frontage by building a road. And with new frontage on the road comes the possibility for new parcels. And so in many ways, the creation of a subdivision is really something that follows the construction of a road. And that's perhaps the easiest and simplest and clearest way of thinking about it, that you have to create the frontage to conform to a subdivision.
And so the review criteria generally involves minimum lot size, adequate vehicular access, road frontage, and then making sure that there's adequate infrastructure, such as fire protection, roads, sidewalks, water and sewer. And so the process for reviewing subdivision is, I think under statute it's actually pretty broad, but generally most communities across the U.S. follow the same process. So there's some form of sketch review. So a developer will come in and, with his idea, the DRB might take a look at it and classify it as a minor subdivision or a major subdivision. I'll get back to that. And so that's kind of like the very first preliminary look at it. Sometimes, I know in Brattleboro, they don't really use sketch review very often. They kind of let people come in and have a conceptual discussion if they want to do that. But there's often not a requirement for a sketch review. You'll have, for a major subdivision, which in Brattleboro is defined as 3 lots or more, or creating a road. That's a major subdivision. It's kind of a 2-step process. First you have preliminary review, and then you have final review. And there's requirements. You have to have notice to the abutters, and you have 45 days to make a decision. So it can take, 6 months more. It depends on where the developer is, but if you have to go through minor subdivision and major subdivision, it's going to take a couple of months.
It depends on how big a subdivision also, right?
To some extent. I mean,
How complicated?
yeah.
How well prepared?
More the latter. It's not something that this jurisdiction sees a lot of, but I think there are plenty of places where large-scale subdivisions of 50 or more parcels are handled, relatively easily. It's a matter of the commitment of the engineering work and so forth at the beginning of the process that's usually the question. So for developers, they want to get an early indication of what the expectations of the regulating board are, and then respond to that. So to them, to some extent, having at least 2 meetings is effective. But there's no reason to drag it out. I mean, it can be a big subdivision, and if you are willing to commit the resources as a developer, it can be done.
And
quickly.
what triggers Act 250 permits? I mean, isn't it size of development? I can't remember.
Yes, so here it's either 10 acres or 10 parcels, whichever is the smaller.
Act
So
250 is
under
the
Act
state
250,
land use
yeah,
permit.
Right.
So that would also lengthen the process some. No?
Well, it does.
I mean, it
I
does.
don't want to sound callous. It does for the developer. It doesn't for the local
That's right.
approving body. Right. Yeah. I mean, that's the way I'd say it. So
Yes.
it's a factor for the developer to consider.
Some subdivisions, a minor subdivision, so if it doesn't require a road and it's less than 3 lots, that can often just go to one hearing called final subdivision review. They come in with a plan that has all the required information, and it can be reviewed and usually can be approved.
Would that
So
be
no
like
decision will
private
be issued.
drive into a piece of land that created 2 or 3 lots out of one?
A private drive.
Or how does that?
A
You can
private
have-
drive is going to be considered a road.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's the driveway and then
Right.
the
A driveway
road,
cannot
whether it's
service
public or
more than 3 911 addresses before. If it's 3 or more, no, if it's more than 3, it has to meet town road standards. Basically,
Okay.
you can't have a really, really long driveway with 10 houses off it.
Yeah.
Right. So
But you can have up to 3.
So yeah, something like a kind of almost like a cul-de-sac setting or something like that is not uncommon.
Yeah, or a family wanted to subdivide and sell to lots to each of their couple of their kids or something, and
Yep,
kind of have a whole
that's
little.
not unusual either.
Yeah.
But yeah, 3's the limit.
Okay.
Currently, you may have heard of such thing as a lot line adjustment or a boundary line adjustment. So that's where you have 2 existing parcels next to each other, and maybe they decide to do a land swap, or for whatever reason they need to move a property line. That is also considered a subdivision. And right now, our regulations require that it be reviewed by the Development Review Board. There's probably pros and cons against that, or to doing that. But oftentimes those
To
can
doing
be-
it meaning bringing it to the DRB?
Yeah.
Yeah.
But oftentimes they're handled administratively.
So in some jurisdictions,
we're not currently
right,
doing that.
Right. Some jurisdictions it's handled administratively. Here it goes before the DRB.
Yeah, I've seen that on their agenda, lot line stuff.
Yeah, yeah, they've had quite a bit of that lately.
Yeah.
Yep.
So what are the current problems with the subdivision regulations as they exist?
Did you
Yeah, I
get
realized.
that email? Do you want
Yeah. Well, basically, we feel if you had a look at the outline, you kind of have the process, and then you have standards. And we've identified that we think our standards are outdated and
Yeah.
don't meet contemporary planning practice.
Right.
Some examples are our road standards are requiring really big roads. And the standards are often waived. I mean, we require for a rural road a 24-foot traveled way. Oftentimes we see proposals come in at 18 feet, and that's actually consistent with the state guidelines. So right now, we're requiring large roads.
So the rule of thumb then is if the DRB gets way too many requests for a waiver and grants too many waivers, then the problem is with the standard.
Or could be.
Could be.
Yeah, I think a reasonable view is when on particular standards, if you constantly get requests for waivers and the DRB
Constantly grants.
constantly gives them, then I think it's a signal that there's a flaw with that particular standard. So the standard section that we have is both outdated and no longer keeping up with contemporary state standards. It's also predominantly about the location of and the showing in plan form the presence of infrastructure for the most part. So it doesn't really address issues to do with the standards do not relate to how to treat the land per se. It's about making sure that it does two things mostly. It determines what infrastructure is needed and then to what standard it will be built. And so it has a sort of a strong orientation towards the public infrastructure requirements that the town's imposing rather than a set of standards that the developer would use to come up with an attractive and effective subdivision that was using the land efficiently, was responding to the topography and other natural features, and connected with the existing road network or neighborhood in an effective way. And I think that there's also examples of existing subdivisions in Brattleboro where those things, including how well it fits in with the pre-existing road network or other issues, could have been addressed better.
So it's more of an engineered plan than planning.
Yeah, these are predominantly engineering standards. They are not planning or design standards in terms of the actual parcels.
Okay.
And I think
Yeah, and that really is more looking at sense of place and how that contributes to the sense of, well, like you said, I mean, the sense of place and how it fits in with the characteristics of that neighborhood and the town per se. I mean, rather than bulldozing or clear cutting a whole piece of land, looking at what's there, and as in this conservation thing where you go and you look at the land and you see really what's of value
Right.
in the land and the topography and the natural resources there and the orientation. These days, people are thinking more about orientation to the sun for utilities and whatnot. And
Right. And we have some flat land on Putney Road that's probably suitable for subdivision and may end up being subdivided. And so some of these issues are probably not entirely, a big deal for that area, but most of the remaining land in Brattleboro that is, rural or rural residential in character, consists of steep slopes or other, natural features that make it fairly challenging to develop, and that's why it hasn't been developed already. And so things such as road design standards that are mostly about the engineering standards and not about, for instance, how much cut and fill is involved or how much of an impact the road is actually going to have on the topography. Those kinds of things don't really get specified in the current subdivision standards. And one of the things that we've observed is access permits, which is the when somebody establishes a new parcel as part of a subdivision, every parcel gets an access way, basically a driveway that meets the street. Access permits are not they're given with reference to some traffic safety concerns, that sight lines, the distance to the corner, those kinds of questions. But they're not issued with reference to stormwater standards or transporting sheet flow from the property onto the road or those kinds of related concerns. So we don't see the full set of concerns that we would have about access incorporated into the access permit part of the subdivision process or the access permit process in general. So there's just those kinds of things that we keep on bumping into that are of concern to us for the most part.
Now, as far as with the flooding,
Yep. And then
hazard areas.
just a whole bunch of related issues.
Yeah.
Snow storage, stormwater, the impact of access, driveways and so forth on the existing road network. All this kind of stuff is not really addressed in the subdivision standards at all at this point. Is that the list? There was some other stuff we had.
Are there
Yeah,
other towns, let's just say in Vermont first, that have a more, I guess I'll call it, based on your handouts, more of a conservation slant to their subdivision standards as opposed to this more engineering infrastructure related? I mean, do we have examples of that already
I think
in our state?
There's a mix.
Yeah.
I've seen more models that are from Vermont that are definitely treating the landscape more sensitively.
Yep.
Or is it a newer thing here and we're going to look maybe other places for?
I think this is going to sound a little rough, but I'd say
Yeah.
the closer to the coast you are and the more money it's worth,
Right.
the better the standards. And so there's a couple of things actually impacting that. Coastal property is generally worth more, particularly on the East Coast. Well, the West Coast, that's true too. But, because it's nice. And then the other issue that's going on is the impact of water quality standards and a whole bunch of other stuff sort of come together and then push local development regulations in a particular direction. So if you were to look at Chesapeake Bay and Maryland,
Yeah.
you'll see very, very, very strict regulations because of the impact of development on the Chesapeake Bay. You tend to see the same things on the coast of Massachusetts and Cape Cod and those kinds of places, and even New Hampshire, where they're already struggling
Yeah.
to maintain federal standards for water quality, and so they're much more sensitive to the impact of land development on those kinds of issues, and so they're backed into that from that to some extent. I think smart growth initiatives have taken off more comprehensively.
I think Burlington would be a little bit ahead of the game because of the bike thing. Would that be it, or not necessarily?
No,
so?
I haven't looked at Burlington's.
Not that. I
Yeah.
wouldn't
Well, even if these
say-
other places in Vermont haven't adopted them in a post-tropical storm Irene world, they
Yeah.
are probably looking
Thinking
at them
about
just
it.
as we are because of the need for, the steep slope
Yeah.
elements and the other environmental elements
I was
that,
just curious as to if there were, how large a number of other towns in our state were already pursuing this, and maybe not because we're more rural, whereas these other areas you talk about are.
No, I mean,
No?
I think there's varying degrees of environmental standards. I would
Yep.
say, like Norwich, Waitsfield, Warren,
Virginia.
Middlebury,
Maybe.
Middlebury a little
Jericho.
bit. Yeah, and
Right.
they're starting to get out there.
Yeah.
Yep.
For sure.
And I think in the states, in the rest of New England, I think parts of Connecticut, parts of Massachusetts, and parts of New Hampshire do have communities that have adopted fairly strict standards or have taken interesting approaches to things such as conservation development. And it's a little bit more, I was simplifying it in a very basic
Yes,
kind
no,
of
I
way.
just-
But so I think that they're models for us to look at as well. And their last comment is both UConn and UNH both have sort of extension service programs devoted to stormwater management that are really effective and made a lot of progress working with local communities around those issues.
Yeah.
And so to some extent, you'll see communities in those states working with the universities.
Yeah, UNH I think is doing a lot of work with pervious surfaces
Same
too.
with-
Yep. Same with you.
Nemo out of
Right,
UConn.
right. So,
Yeah, the challenge, and we can see a little bit more when we lay out, when we look at the outline, is I haven't seen a lot of communities in Vermont doing a kind of a straight up conservation subdivision ordinance. But at the same time, they're using similar design approaches or standards, for environmental protection in with their general standards. So I think that's important.
yeah, I think
As
we,
well.
we saw in the public hearings for the town plan how much people really needed to understand what we meant by the conservation plan, because it affects so much of the western part of the town.
Right.
Yeah.
And this illustration here is really nice,
Which
as Carolina said.
one are you?
The countryside program.
Yep.
Yeah.
Which is from Pennsylvania, I think. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yep.
And where does the four-step process
Ohio.
come from?
Ohio.
Ohio?
Oops. Yeah.
The four-step process is basically it's Randall Arendt.
Yep.
He's a landscape architect
Yep.
out of Western Massachusetts. He's
Oh.
been kind of promoting this for quite a while now.
Yeah. Rural by Design is one of his famous books. So,
What's his name again?
Randall Arendt. We can give you a reference to that if you want.
So they give you a menu of choices?
Yep.
His name is on the side of this little plan, Carolina.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Yep.
So
Right, okay.
if we just take a step back before talking about the conservation subdivision, basically the difference there is that you're getting flexibility in lot size and some of the setbacks and that kind of those kind of regulations, so that you can cluster on the site in areas that are best suited for development. So you're really designing around nature there, because you're taking a look at the land and you're basically saying, we're going to set aside a certain amount of it as open space. But first, you're going to identify what are the conservation values on that property. So there's the identifying the primary conservation areas and then identifying the secondary conservation areas, kind of ruling those out. Then say we had a requirement for 50% open space, then you're going to kind of figure out what you have left and figure out where houses can go, and then draw the roads in, and then make parcels.
Well, it's very interesting to see these 4 or 5 different options in that Ohio process there, I guess it's Ohio, with the same piece of land, and how you could, what the conventional plan would be, but then how you can still modify that in many different ways, and looking at in terms of what kind of development you want in your town. Do you want more estate lots? Do you want, as they're calling them, or country properties? And how do you work that then? Are those called, what's the word I want? Bonuses would be the right word.
Incentives or
Incentives.
density bonuses. Yeah, that a menu of choice is one. I think it's a bit confusing, but I liked how it can give you some options of, well, if you do have a density bonus,
That's the word I
you
want.
can get more lots. And I think that's something we need to look at, or where are the areas that we might want to promote a density bonus if they are meeting some of the design that we want to see in it.
Because it was very interesting to go from something like 24 lots to 36 lots, or
Right.
even 18, and any of those are what kind of medium density, And I can just think of,
So would this preclude the conventional subdivision in certain areas?
Well, the way that we've talked about it in the town plan is we were recommending that conservation subdivision be used in rural and rural residential, be required. So there is a choice. Do you want to make it required? Do you want to just allow it in some places or encourage it? As
I'm
an
just
option
kind of
of
wondering,
development.
where would someone want a conventional lot? And it's kind of like, passé.
It is. And we could probably call it that and help. We could have the passe subdivision section
Yes.
and the cool one. and that would help them decide. So that's actually a good idea. We should do that. Have signs that have to go at the front of the subdivision going passe. So
Old fashioned.
yeah, old geezer style. Anyway, so I think we left the conventional subdivision in place for either the limited number of medium-ish sized parcels that are inside the 91 kind of corridor, right? So there's still a number of parcels that are already in a sort of a built-up neighborhood where we're assuming that it would be subdivided in a fairly traditional way. And then and the commercial and industrial subdivision process. So we wanted to leave a conventional subdivision process in place for that also, I guess. But I'm thinking now even, well, I guess the land that's above Brookside, that's rural residential now, right?
No, that's a way up,
Well,
or the one we saw the PRD on.
the one they have the PID on.
That's residential.
Residential, okay. So there's nothing preventing a conventional subdivision happening there, really,
That's right.
right?
Would you want to set a steep slope standard
We do.
for the use?
We do. That's also proposed in the town plan, that there be a special, response on the part of the developer to slopes 15% and steeper.
Yeah.
Like, would they be channeled into using the conservation
We
subdivision?
don't actually say that in the plan, but we do say that there'd be design standards specific to dealing with slopes of 15% and above and steeper.
But even if you have all of these standards that you want people to follow, if we don't have a way to enforce it,
Well, we do. We have that. I mean,
Well, that would be the DRB's
The
role.
DRB's role.
To enforce it.
yeah, but so they have plans that look pretty, but in all reality, are they, when construction starts and they're starting to,
well, it's
I
been
mean,
a long time since we've had to do that. But so we probably need to brush up on it a little and get a much bigger measuring tape. But
Well, there's one in process.
Well, but you'd
Yeah.
have a subdivision, let's say you had a conservation subdivision, there's a series of standards that have to be met. So it's not just a pretty picture, it's conforming to the
Right.
rules that are set forth.
and that has to get laid out in
Yeah.
particular. I mean,
I mean, even there's been a couple of times where we put a site plan before the DRB and it's like, high five, great, and then the site doesn't end up looking like that at all because of whatever. They're just like, it's cheaper to do it this way, so we'll just,
we
That's a
should
bigger
talk-
problem than
Yeah, we should
subdivision
talk about that later.
regulations.
It's a different, yeah.
What I'd say is that's not supposed to happen. And there are certainly mechanisms in both the subdivision regulations and the zoning ordinance to prevent that from happening. So what I'd say is,
I know towns that have stopped construction
Yes.
because the building was a foot higher than it needed to be.
Wow.
Right.
yeah, but I know places like that too, but this is Brattleboro. It just seems like it's very, I'm just curious as to the,
Enforcement, you're talking about?
yeah, how do you get people, how do you make sure that all of these standards that we're talking about, how do you make sure that
I think
people are doing that?
from our standpoint, from our office's standpoint, and from the DRB standpoint, the documentation of the permitting process needs to be very rigorous, and then
The quality of the plan.
the quality of the plans need to be really good. I mean,
Because ultimately, that's what you enforce with.
right. And I think where you see some, I'm not aware of a large number of subdivisions where you go and you can't identify what's on the ground because you've been looking at the plan.
Who, does Brian enforce that kind of stuff, or is it you guys?
Brian is a zoning administrator, so he has the enforcement role, and he's supported by us. But I'd say we've not dealt with a complaint about, a road being laid out the wrong way, or being too wide or too narrow, or going in the wrong direction, or my parcel was supposed to be shaped like a triangle and it's a hexagon. What's going on? We haven't had any of those kinds of things.
So they're still in compliance, as long as they're in compliant with
Right.
the original plan, there's no one out there, there's like a site supervisor, someone to oversee, make sure, okay.
Right. I think.
Right.
Well, They must get certificates of occupancy.
You get a certificate of
Most
occupancy
of the
for a
states.
structure. The problem is more to do with once you've laid out a subdivision, you've got a road and some drains or something maybe. How do we know that that's right?
Yeah. Did they
Well,
do
why
it?
don't we write into these rules that we're writing some sort of
Inspection
no
process.
ticky, no
Apply
Yeah.
dirty
for supervision,
clause.
some type of oversight or whatever.
What-
Make sure that road is being put in.
What kind of clause?
No ticket, no shirt.
Yeah. All right. Yeah, we'll use that. Along with the, what was it? Passe subdivision.
Yeah.
To be honest, I think one of the good questions, you raised a good question from a policy standpoint, and that is, I'm sure that conventional subdivisions are more expensive and less efficient for developers and for towns to take over once they're built out and got more problems with them. But I think from a regulatory standpoint, the simple nature of them makes them easier to enforce and ensure that it's done right. And so if there's a rationale or a justification for keeping it simple, that would be it. But I think that the downside of conventional subdivisions is so significant that I don't think the long-term costs. I think the long-term costs outweigh the short-term benefits of having a simple-to-implement subdivision standard.
And the extra land that's left over, who owns that?
Well,
That's
it needs to be managed in some way. So it could be, a homeowners association. It could be, an easement that some conservation organization buys, or the town.
Right.
It could be the developer holds on to that land and puts in,
you could put it in trust. So for instance,
But I think that is
Right.
one of the
the questions.
questions about if everything has to be conservation subdivision.
Who pays taxes on it, though? It just depends on.
Depends on how
Yeah.
it's
How
how it's owned.
Yeah. So you could put it in so-called current use, for example, and it reduces the tax rate. So actually, while we're on this point, I think I just want to make sure that people got sort of the subtlety of this. So if you look at the countryside program, the two drawings by Randall Arendt in the bottom there, the so-called conventional layout on the right and the conservation development layout on the left. The major land feature is actually a brook. And what you see with the conventional layout is that the brook basically bisects a whole bunch of houses' backyards. And so what that does is, I guess on the upside, it gives each household private access to a waterway. The downside is that if you wanted to go for a walk along the waterway or fish or have some other kind of engagement with the waterway,
Maybe trespassing.
you're trespassing across everybody else's land and they could prevent you from doing that. Whereas if you look at the conservation development layout, the key physical feature is the brook with its little tributaries, and the subdivision is laid out around it so that everybody can access that key feature without trespass. And so that, I'm not even sure how obvious that is to many people when you actually offer them the two alternatives. I suspect that there might be some people who really want, or who would prefer their little slice of the brook versus being in a neighborhood that gets to share a brook.
So it gets back to early childhood education.
Because the community.
I've got my chunk of brook and I'm not sharing.
Mine. Parallel play.
Just saying. But I think that goes to those questions then of if you're going to have a homeowners association or you're going to place it in conservation or those kinds of things. There are some management issues that come up from that. But I also think that what you're beginning to see is that there's this really significant neighborhood benefit. And there's nothing preventing, this neighborhood from establishing a trail or whatever and then it being accessible, to people who don't live in that neighborhood. So there's a way in which it does actually build community identity and community spirit. just because it rearranges the private property boundary lines around the landscape, not across the landscape, I guess is what I'm trying to get at.
Do we want to have some sort of standard that says it can't be private?
The open space?
Yeah.
Well, I've seen that as a density bonus.
Yeah.
If you allow it open to the general public, then you can get a density bonus
Right.
off of that.
Right. And you know, obviously the point of keeping on offering density bonuses is at some point it should bring down the development costs of each parcel, and then that makes the properties more affordable. And then there are more, if it's a homeowners association setting, then there are more property owners to share the costs of operating the homeowners association as well. Right? So,
Because I could see you could get into a real quagmire if the town didn't want the property or to maintain the property, and the homeowners association didn't want to. And
Yeah.
no conservation group took it up. Then you'd be like, now what?
How much maintenance would there actually be, though? I mean,
pretty much none.
yeah.
I mean, that's what's going on now.
Yeah.
I mean,
Well, it depends if there was trails or if there was some
Right.
storm
Yeah,
and there
or-
was
right,
If it was
Right.
agricultural.
stream bank restoration that needed to happen or something.
right. I mean, that's the other thing. These
Erosion on a steep slope.
conservation easement pictures generally show, I guess the one on the next handout, the Growing Greener Conservation by Design one, from the National Lands Trust. The one on the first page, the one on the right, identifies meadows and upland woods. I guess those meadows could be meant as, you know, agricultural land type meadows, or they could just be maintained as meadows. I think the word that they use for it is glading, kind of a New Jersey landscaping term.
Some of us see meadow as developable lot.
Oh, I see. But I think the one conservation subdivision that I've seen in practice was actually the reuse of the taking over of farmland and turning it into a residential community, but preserving the pasture lands and cornfields of the farm, and even the barns and outhouses associated with the farm operation. So the farmer moved off. And then the people that took over the property basically found a farmer to work the land that remained, but they needed a different financing package, so they subdivided sort of around the edge of it. And so they got the benefits of a rural setting, like they felt like they were living on a farm, right? Because they were. So the land that was held in conservation and the meadows and so forth were associated with agricultural activity.
Isn't that a development called Prairie Crossing or something? There's some place.
I can't remember what it
I've
was
seen
called.
something like that illustrated either in
Yeah.
a TV show or a magazine
Yeah.
or something.
So, I mean, so in that instance, the ownership question, it could be a land trust. So it could be something equivalent to, not Bonnie Vale, Earthbridge. There's a land trust in town. Well, there's a land trust that's active both here and in Putney that has land that is just wooded lands and then also farmland. And it's held in trust, and sustains quite a large number of residential households on the same land.
I think with people coming more into the local food kind of thing, there's people who want to preserve
Right,
farmland or on parcels when you do development.
right,
Subdivisions, they want to have a mix of being able to do all that, having woodlands
yep,
and meadows or farmlands where you can have some agricultural land there too.
right. So I think the ownership question is, the challenge with the ownership question is that it would almost be different every time you did it.
Yeah.
And then, for the developer, then that's a key part of the puzzle to solve, kind of up front. Like, am I going to work with this land trust? Am I going to, form a homeowners association from the get-go? There's the other possibility that we haven't seen anything of really here either, which is co-housing and intentional communities forming and subdividing land in this way, or using these kinds of tools to subdivide land. And
It's
that,
probably coming, though.
yeah, I'd say so.
There's lots of materials on how to manage the open space,
Yep.
kind of
Uh-huh.
going over the different options, so get that out to you for the next.
Right. And if you were to, under Vermont law, when you have 20, is it 25 or 26? I can never remember because you have an acre or something for the homestead, right?
Oh, it's 27,
So it's 27.
2 acres per homestead.
Right. So in this instance, you could have one parcel that's 25 acres and that could be held in conservation if it was open space attached to the subdivision. And so therefore as long as you have a management plan for that concept, for that space, you attract lower land taxes. And so typically here that would mean a forestry plan. So some harvesting of wood over time. So the
A
forest
little bit
itself.
like I don't know if it's quite that way with this Chester County Township thing where there's a historic horse farm
Right.
adjacent to a subdivision.
Right. Yep.
Yeah.
There's a lot to be learned from Chester County.
So a couple of things that we need to identify in the conservation subdivision regulations is, what are the primary conservation areas? And those are the unbuildable areas, so they're kind of easier to target. But what are the secondary conservation areas? Those significant features that we in Brattleboro want to protect.
So that, you mean generally, so when we look at a piece of land, we can have a guide to look at, is that what you're saying?
Yeah, because, the guideline, the standards there'll be standards of what they need to include in these conservation areas. And those are the areas you could not locate homes in. So for the primary conservation areas, it's generally unbuildable areas. So it's going to be the steep slopes. In this case, probably over 20 or, because you can build over 15.
Yep.
Wetlands, floodplains, that kind of thing?
Yeah, wetlands, yeah, exactly.
Wetlands, open water.
Oh,
I mean, you don't want houseboats?
I'm thinking bamboo poles. One thing that we don't have in there, which is a little odd, but I think might be worth trying to provide something equivalent to a density bonus for, is land that's been severely damaged. I know, it's a little odd.
Like, what do you mean?
Okay, so a former quarry or, an area of land that's been very heavily impacted by some prior use, and that if
Heavily logged, say, for instance?
What's that?
Heavily logged.
Yeah,
And not
that's,
dealt with in a good way.
and not dealt with in a sensitive way. So you've got severe erosion problems, or you've got,
Scrap stuff left behind.
and so rather than locating the homes in the more pristine, less impacted areas, you actually choose to rehabilitate the damaged land, and you can get bonus points for that.
That's like a lot of the flooded areas. A lot of
Well,
the erosion,
You don't wanna-
damage.
Yeah,
You don't wanna
there's an
build
issue
in
that there's a
flooded
different
areas.
issue with that, but
It's more
yeah.
like redevelopment in the Putney Road area, I would imagine.
Right, that would be another equivalent. But I was thinking more, there's this whole kind of ethical question about why would you go and cut down trees and make building sites on a really nice hillside when over there you have, the remnants of an old quarry or something, or poorly, as Carolyn pointed out, poorly logged land that's somehow damaged. It could be perfectly appropriate to develop as house sites if it was, if you took on the stewardship thing, and then you'd leave the pristine land pristine.
Do we, have any way of identifying those areas?
It could be an option open to the developers, right? So if they identified this piece of the parcel as somehow impacted from prior human use, and they were going to remediate that in some ways, which could even include bringing in topsoil or doing whatever they need to do. And then identify the other slopes or whatever it is and say, these are unimpacted, these have been undamaged, and we're going to preserve those.
So they get a
They
density
will get
bonus
a density
for
bonus
that.
for taking on the
Yeah.
task of rehabilitating the land.
It's kind of like all the elements of a LEED neighborhood development standards.
Right.
And how the points? What does that go towards? It's like an Act 250. You have to have a certain amount of points.
Well, here what we're trying to do is figure out how to give them density bonuses. So you'd have some kind of scoring system, and depending on what you did as to how many points you'd accumulate or whatever, and then that would equate to being allowed to have a higher level of density on that part of the land that you were planning to develop than
So
otherwise permitted.
more than the zoning would
Yes,
allow.
more than
Yeah.
Okay.
Right.
Yeah, that's what it's.
Now, one of the weirder things about Vermont is that in all our long-term research on this, Sue and I have been talking about this together for years. We don't know of a place in Vermont that does PUDs or PRDs or any form of subdivision process that actually engages in meaningful density bonuses that are taken up. I think maybe Stowe or something. I mean, like outside of a ski resort town, I don't think it will be. And it's really uncommon here. And it's
Might be changing.
Might
I
be
mean, I
changing,
think it's
yeah.
just a progression of really old
Yep.
regulations.
Whereas outside of, in our experience, in the rest of New England, and the closer you get to more dense communities, it's the density bonus that is driving a whole lot of development. I mean, that's basically what developers are going for in a really big way.
And, well, it's the kind of thing that, the comments that we heard on the town plan, they were really concerned about the acreage limitations.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and if they understood the conservation subdivision and the density bonus, then I think they'd be more disposed to understand and like the elements of the plan.
Right. Right.
And there's nothing wrong with being on the cutting edge, is there?
I don't know. I'll let you know when I find it.
Okay.
Well, you jumped ahead to density bonus,
Oh my God, I'm sorry.
which it is up for discussion. What other kind of things? So we can either stick with the density bonus. What kind of things do we think? What kind of designs are we trying to encourage that we could give a density bonus for?
Right.
But we can also go back and identify the secondary conservation areas, those kind of significant natural and cultural features that we want to be set aside as well. So,
Are you asking? Is that what?
yeah, do we want to do? Let's do
Okay.
secondary conservation
Yeah,
areas.
I think that's a good idea.
So the primary ones were steep slopes, wetlands, open water, damaged lands, open space.
No, we don't want damaged lands.
We don't want
'cause
damaged lands in there.
We
Yeah.
want them to develop on damaged lands. So this is where Rod jumped ahead.
I'm sorry.
Started talking about density bonus.
I got.
Yeah, primary
Well-
ones are things where you don't want buildings.
Yeah, so that would be I think damaged lands are maybe a secondary conservation.
And what
Or not.
about forests?
I think forests
Secondary.
secondary.
Or certain trees. I mean, I can think of that big tree on Putney Road, say, for instance,
Specimen trees?
specimen
Yes.
trees, thank you.
Specimen trees.
Right. Big ones. Right.
Yeah, but those occur in many different places.
Yep.
Now,
I mean,
when you talk,
even on this secondary
yeah,
map, I think there's one, yes, there's
Right.
a great oak
yeah.
Right.
right in the middle of the meadow.
So we have some ideas of significant features would be open fields, high value natural areas, prime ag soils, which there aren't prime ag soils in Vermont, but there are, or in Brattleboro, but there are statewide, there's soils with statewide agricultural importance.
So the designation is that they're of significance on a statewide basis.
So if that were the case, then they'd have to be mapped for Brattleboro so that
We have,
residents would know.
yeah, we
Yeah,
have,
we have it
we
now,
have that
we have
layout.
that. Yeah.
Yeah.
Mature woodlands, stone walls, tree lines, existing historic structures, scenic, I think this one's really important. They're all important, but
Scenic views?
scenic views into and out of the property. I mean, we did take some time in the town plan and map some of these areas
Right.
as well. Trails and hilltops, are other suggestions. So, but there's more that we
All
can
these
consider.
things, you don't have them on a sheet of paper here.
No.
You've got
Sorry.
them. You have the cheat sheet
I
over
have the
there?
cheat
There's the
sheet.
master
Yeah.
list. Now, question, I was going to ask in regards to vegetation. And in that part here on page, I don't know, it's 1B3, it says comparison countryside program. When you're mentioning the historical and cultural structures, when you're dealing with vegetation and natural environments and having to move whatever's living there at that time, how does that work with the developmental structure with that? When you're going to start building, how do you relocate things? I think I was reading an article in the paper, they found it was a spider that was on the endangered species list, so they had to stop production completely, so shut it down. So when you're running into things like that, how does that formulate?
Well, in the conservation subdivision, you would map those things out beforehand and you would avoid those areas.
More like,
Anything that's contaminated areas, you would know, like soil, because they come in doing soil samples and all that stuff.
Well, that's a whole different.
Only in
Oh.
areas
Like
that
habitat
there's a
corridors.
presumption that there is such a thing.
Right. I mean, I think you're talking about, sorry, Caroline, if you're talking about rural or rural residential areas in Brattleboro,
Right.
it could be a question mark over the history of the parcel in terms of what its prior use was, but you would be able to make a pretty informed judgment by looking at it. So if it was fully wooded, you might come across some old agricultural equipment or something rusting away,
An
or
old tank or something.
yeah, or even
Or a house that
an old
sat
cellar
there.
hole,
cellar hole.
plenty of cellar holes and all that kind of stuff. But that's not going to constitute, enough of a hazard for you to think that you're going to have to start doing soil sampling and those kinds of things. Partly, the areas of town that are more developed and they've had mixed history in terms of their use, there might be a vacant lot, but yeah, that would be different. You'd want to check it out.
I'm not sure how you would put that into subdivision regulations. I mean, there's so many
Yeah.
Variables.
liability issues for a developer
Right.
anyway that hopefully they're doing their due diligence and would have it tested and wouldn't locate
Right.
Yeah.
something that's going to be exposed there. And so that's going to help make the developer make decisions.
Yeah, because I was saying if you have to relocate or move something that's been there historically for years, you would have to work around that, say, for instance, like if...
But you wouldn't, with the conservation subdivision, you wouldn't relocate. So if say it was an animal or it was some sort of habitat, you kind of, if it was in a designated habitat corridor or something like that, you just avoid that whole part.
Or
You
if
know,
it's
that-
a historic stone wall, you
Right.
wouldn't move it. You'd work.
just leave
You'd
it.
work with it.
You'd work around it or with it.
Yeah.
And that's the nice part about the conservation subdivision, because it is preserving those natural and cultural resources
Right.
better. Under a conventional subdivision, you'd stick a lot line through it, and then
Who cares?
some
Right,
individual owns
exactly.
it, and they could
Do whatever they want.
do whatever they want.
So even in the instance of say there's an intact old barn and
Right.
it's got some merit.
Right.
Well, that might be an area that you would include in the open space so that people have got access, access to the barn for whatever reason, that it doesn't just end up on one person's parcel or something such
Or
as
maybe
that.
somebody wants to live in the barn.
Yeah, exactly. And I think the one example I can think of is where the barn stayed they turned it into car storage for part of it and a bus shelter for kids for the school bus for the other part of it, and left it on the property, and it sort of formed, the driveway went past the barn, and that was kind of the entrance to the property. And you couldn't tell from walking up and down the street that they were basically storing their cars and stuff in there, or their boats and stuff like that. It was just sort of a storage area, and the kids, everyone got to use the bus shelter. It was good, so it was fine.
I guess I would
They got bonus points for that.
Right.
along with these same kinds of things, thinking ahead. I mean, we don't have them here at the moment, like when you mentioned co-housing, but when I think of the Cobb Hill co-housing, say for instance, I mean, they have a barn and a farm and animals, but they also have their wood boiler that heats the whole,
right.
and they use their wood lots, and so I'd want to be sure that our conservation, whatever we write up,
Right.
allows for
Preservation.
future kinds of things that really we don't
Right.
have at the moment, and even things that maybe are even a little more cutting edge than that. I'm not sure, but I do see and hear people wanting to be able to incorporate all that kind of thing, you know, as we look at a world that has higher oil prices or less oil, less shortages of oil and whatnot, and how can we, the kind of local movement kind of thing, not that we'll ever be totally independent, that's not the way the world is at the moment, but to be able to allow people to cluster their homes, however, I mean, not always just in a subdivision, but that it allows for
Right.
cottage communities or co-housing or whatever the term might be. I don't know how you would generalize that enough to allow it to be, you know.
Well, I think we wouldn't get
You wouldn't have to
so
be that
specific about what types, but I think what I'm hearing that is important there is where can you allow these other uses?
Multiple
so,
uses
You know, if
on
there's
it.
like a cogen power, can that be in the open space or can it not?
Yeah.
I mean, we have to decide how much we want to allow or require for open space, but then also how
What-
can it be used?
Right. What
You know,
constitutes
like
open
what-
space? Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, so I know one town in New Hampshire had basically 3 different types of open space. They had active space, limited use space, and then conservation. So maybe
Yeah.
sticking like a community septic system or,
Right.
That's right.
or a cogen plant in a limited use area would be okay,
Or a living
but not in the
machine.
conservation or something.
living machine kind of thing.
Yep.
So I think
Yeah.
that's what we need to think about.
Yeah. Great.
There's how do we structure our open space? Like another town in New Hampshire, there were only regulations where, not the only, but just to simplify it, so you had to have 40% of the development needed to be in open space. Of that 40%, 40% of it actually had to be usable open space. So it couldn't just be your steep slopes and wetlands and surface
Yeah, yeah,
waters.
yeah.
Because they didn't, you just can't give the residents that kind of land. It had to be more. And then 60% of the open space had to be contiguous. So this is where you get into the kind of design standards of the open space. So you don't want it, you want it to be a usable chunk that then connects up to other open spaces.
That's right. That's right.
In the lands, in the town.
And so we can have that all written in some way.
Yeah, you want to avoid fragmentation.
Yeah.
And,
Thank you. That's the word.
Right. Yeah.
So what are some of the other secondary conservation that we think are a priority, if you could think back to the town plan, or, I know you don't have my list, so I apologize.
Well, I think some of those cultural things that we've already mentioned, cellar holes, stone walls,
Trails,
Trails.
Trail.
trails that are
stone
there.
walls, historic properties, scenic views.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, or already, well, when I say sometimes on little brooks, there's already sort of the swimming hole where kids already go kind of thing. You know, that's harder to document, but
Is there anything in here that that talks about the amount of land you're allowed to clear cut, or
yeah.
No, that would be one of the things that we would need to establish. Right.
Does the town already have something like that, like trees that are a certain diameter.
Yeah,
No, I don't
or to
think
thin
so.
out.
The existing subdivision regs say
And
something
leave.
about, but I don't. There's something kind of vague in the existing subdivision regulations about.
Well, I think that would be something that we'd be interested in having, not only in these, but in the regular
Absolutely.
subdivision.
I mean, I think there's a lot that actually will fall under what we consider to be our general standards. The stormwater management, the erosion control, the roads.
Well, leaving as many of a certain size tree and larger, or leaving a certain amount of natural vegetation helps already with stormwater control and whatnot, depending on the topography.
Right.
They're obviously looking for something.
We're looking for any comment. Required trees. Section 455. Each residential lot shall have at least 3 trees 2 inches in diameter at a point 6 inches
serious?
above finished grade level.
Are you serious?
Yeah.
Trees.
We have a very suburban. I mean, I think that
Yeah.
assumes a clear cut, and then
New trees will be at least 5 feet outside the right of way. Trees shall be hardy, plastic, suitable to local soil and climate, and shall be of a species approved by the Development Review Board.
Ugh.
So there should be a requirement
Well-
under both subdivisions to
Yeah.
survey the existing
Yeah.
trees on site
Yeah.
Yes.
and retain a certain percentage that are a certain.
Right. Of diameter.
Diameter.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Yep.
Yeah, and then the other thing, I remember we had talked about, this wasn't here, this was when you first came on, Rod, we were having some kind of subcommittee, but not just creating landscaping or leaving certain landscaping, but being sure that what's left isn't damaged
Right.
in any way, and that there's like a year or two
Yep.
out that
Right.
makes sure that there's either maintenance of the newly planted and or things like the I forget what they call it, the root capacity of a tree is equal to its
It's canopy. The
canopy,
root ball
leaf
area
canopy.
has, is
And
roughly equal to
if
its
you have
canopy.
too many trucks
Right.
tromping over all that, you
Right.
at least kill a tree, but it takes a few years for that to happen. So we want to be sure that there's
Right.
at least some guidelines there that go a little bit into the future in terms of maintenance, and
Right.
So-
I don't know if maintenance is exactly the right word, but
Right.
So our next meeting is the joint meeting with the DRB.
Yep.
Will we be presenting them with an outline of this program? And asking for their input on?
Yes, I would say that we could do that. I guess my expectation from them is that they'll engage in what they would refer to as the process issues. It means that they waive many requirements or find themselves going kind of 1 step forward and 2 steps back, or some sort of clumsiness as to the way the like the way that they will look at the sketch plan, meeting almost entirely now.
so they'll
and
be
do-
bringing to us.
It'll be those kinds of things that they want to discuss with us more than anything else.
Yeah. Okay.
Because it
I
was
think that you should-
interesting, based on their comments on the town plan, that they kind of took 2 steps forward and 1 step back about what they wanted in terms of development regulations, because they also want flexibility.
Right, and I think that we need to be clear as a planning commission. You need to be clear. We need to be able to give you clear advice, and you need to be able to resolve clearly for yourselves when you're making a policy statement and how to articulate that clearly, and then that gives the direction that you need to give to the DRB to implement. And then the question around flexibility is, at what point does flexibility become policy making on the hop? And that I think needs to
And
be.
what point does it become a planning responsibility?
Right,
Right. That per conversation that we mentioned during the last,
right.
And how do we allow,
what
What are-
flexibility.
what are the parameters for flexibility? Or can we not designate that?
What's your definition of flexibility?
Yeah. Well, I think
in our policy making.
Right.
well, rigid is a bad word, and flexibility is regarded as a good word. Flexibility is also wobbly. So if it's not clear, then you're going to get you're going to get inconsistent implementation.
But the more specific we get, the harder it's going to be to get it passed.
There's that issue. So yeah, it's definitely a balance. I think demarcating the roles really clearly is probably the first step, and so things like the items that we were just discussing, I think it's good to get their DRB's input on what's wrong with the current process and what we can iron out in that way. I think it's good to present them in broad terms the work that we've reviewed tonight, so that they get a sense of what the conservation subdivision process would look like. And if they've got concerns or uncertainties about that, then it would be good to hear about that, get their reaction early on. But I'd say that this is pretty early for us. We're a long way away from saying anything concrete.
Right.
Yeah, that's for sure.
So it's pretty speculative on that level. And then I think,
So we'll be listening next meeting.
yeah,
Well, I
Rather
think that
than
you should,
delegating.
but I think that you should ask questions though too. I mean, I'd like to hear from them. What do they see are the issue with the design standards that we have now?
right. Right. So if
I mean, I know some of the issues, but
Right.
Like, do they laugh about the tree thing too, like we just did?
yeah,
Right.
why don't they work with
Right.
the subdivisions that they see that come forward, or what?
So, yeah, we might think of questions to ask them too.
right, and I think
So-
I would like to hear from the longer term board members as to how, where does applying the subdivision regulations become difficult for them, and where do they start kind of duct taping over the process to make it work, because that's what we should be really focusing on. And if, in an effort to get the process go smoothly, they're relaxing standards that are out of date or whatever it is, we need to know what those are. And then, I think it's fair to say that they don't see too many large-scale subdivision applications either, and haven't for a long time. And so it's, it's an opportunity to sort of connect with them and say, what steps can be simplified, and where can you encourage flexibility. I think flexibility works great when everyone is really well informed and there's a lot of professional activity, and the feedback loop is pretty short, so that you don't wait, years and years to find out whether that flexibility that you offered the last person 10 years ago was a really bad idea or not. That you'd typically see it in the space of 1 or 2 years, maybe, and so therefore you could learn that quickly. I mean, I think to some extent we are literally dealing with a cycle more on the 20 to 30 year scale, right? Which is, to put it in blunt terms, it's almost a professional planner's entire career, right? So we're talking 5 planning directors ago. It's a long time. Really long time. So that's
Trying to get the
and I
overview, but-
don't want to sort of get into a philosophical discussion with them about flexibility versus rigidity either, but I think we need to find out what the sense from the board is as to which parts break down and why they break down, and what is it that we can do about that. And then if they're interested in this conservation stuff, it would be great to share it with them, but I'm not sure it's formed well enough
Yeah.
to share, really.
And flexibility is really an absence of standards.
Yes.
So that's not what we're about.
Flexibility in the development community is code for, I'm the developer and I'll tell you what I want, and then you're going to say yes.
That's flexibility.
Yep, that's
Definitely.
Yeah, wow.
Yeah, that's what I know.
Guess we don't want that.
All right.
Well, are
Well.
we done?
Sounds like a good stopping point.
Shall we adjourn?
I move.
Second. Second
All
motion.
right.
Thanks. Thanks for the